The day arrived. Job's sons and daughters were consuming food and drinking wine within their brother's house, the firstborn. A message bearer came. He said, "The herd was plowing. Next to them the female asses grazed. Sabaeans pounced and took them. With their swords they bit the lads, and only I alone escaped to tell." Again, a message bearer came. He said, "A fire from God descended from the sky, engulfed the flock, devoured the lads, and only I alone escaped to tell." Again, a message bearer came. He said, "Chaldeans mustered in 3 hosts. They stole your camels. With their swords they bit the lads, and only I alone escaped to tell." Again, a message bearer came. He said, "Your sons and daughters were consuming food and drinking wine within their brother's house, the firstborn. And see, a desert wind grew great and came against the house from both sides, lashing all 4 corners. It collapsed upon the lads, and they died. Only I alone escaped to tell." Job raised himself up, tore his robe, cut off his hair, and flung himself face down upon the soil. He said, "Naked I was taken from my mother's belly, naked I will go back. The Lord gives, and the Lord takes. Blessed be the Lord's name." In all this, Job did not sin. He did not fault God. In the last episode, I was dressed to appear where the author of the book of Job took us in those verses, which was to the throne of God. This time I'm dressed for a funeral. There's a lot of tragedy in Job chapter 1, verses 13 through 22. But behind all of the tragedy, there's a hope of transition, of translation, of rebirth. And it turns out that that too is a very fundamental theme of the book of Job. Now, in this portion of the book of Job, there are a lot of references, direct and indirect, to a particular form of translation. And that form of translation is the process of eating. What is eating, after all, but translating the food that we take in into something useful for our body? It either becomes the energy that allows us to get on with the business of life, or it becomes the very substance of our body. It becomes our flesh, our bone, our blood, our organs. So eating is a form of transition, and there are a lot of references to eating in this passage, direct and indirect. The 2 direct references to eating are the sons and daughters eating and drinking, and the she-asses eating grass, grazing by the cattle. There are also indirect references to eating. The cattle, the oxen, are plowing. Why does one plow but to plant? Why does one plant but to reap? Why does one reap but to eat the grain that one has reaped? The text speaks about the Sabaeans and the Chaldeans putting the servants, the lads, to the sword. But the particular language in the Hebrew text is telling, because it speaks of the Sabaeans, it speaks of the Chaldeans striking the lads with the mouth of the sword. In other words, the Sabaeans, the Chaldeans, are devouring the lads with the swords. Their swords are devouring the servants. So at least metaphorically or symbolically, the slaughter of these lads is tied by language to the theme of eating, which is a form of translation. But maybe on some level of abstraction, the author of Job is inviting us to think, could it be more than just a symbol or a metaphor? Could there be, underneath this language, some hint of the author's belief that death is not the end of things? We'll get to that later. What's left? Well, there are the sheep and the shepherds. What happens to the sheep and the shepherds? A fire comes down from heaven and consumes them. This is simply a sacrifice, a different kind of a sacrifice, but the kind of sacrifice that we have seen in 1 Kings. In 1 Kings, the prophet Elijah had a contest with the prophets of Baal to see whose sacrifice God would honor. And God honored Elijah's sacrifice by sending fire down from heaven to consume it. And so here. It's interesting when you look at some of the writing about the ancient attitude toward sacrifice. If you read Mary Douglas, Leviticus's literature, she talks about the fact that the ancient Hebrews and other ancient peoples did not see a sacrifice as a termination of a life. It was a translation of a life. The sheep or the goats or the cattle that they sacrificed and burned on the altar were carried in the flames up to heaven, not dead but alive, translated by that sacrifice from a creature dwelling on earth into a creature dwelling with God. It was a living gift. It seems to me that that's why the ancient Hebrews splashed the blood which contained the life of the creature on the side of the altar, because this was part of that translation. So again, what could look like a death is actually more of a, or stands for a transition, a translation. What's left? Well, the camels, the she-asses were carried off. Well, that's nothing from their point of view but a transition. Before they belonged to Job, before they were tended to by the servants. Now they belong to the Sabaeans, they belong to the Chaldeans. Transition. That's all. Okay then, what about the sons and the daughters of Job? This is where I see the concept of transition or translation breaking down. I do not see how the author has signaled a transition or a translation except the transition to death. They were alive and now they're dead. And there are at least two things that are highly ironic about the children being the one group of people who seem not to participate in a translation or a transition from one form of life to another. These children are associated in this first chapter of Job with the most profound attempt to establish permanence. After all, what is a house but an attempt to establish a permanent abode? And what are children except a way to project oneself into the future? Since the beginning of time, people have been aware that we die. But with children, it's possible to project oneself into the future. That's oftentimes why people have children. I don't, but people I know that do have children can look forward to something of them living on from generation to generation. And that's why, though they had their flaws, Job doted on his children. That's why he assiduously sacrificed to try to insulate them against their own sins. And when that house falls, it is a metaphor for the fall of Job's house, because his endeavor to project himself into the future now seems to have failed. And what was it that did them in? Well, others were done in by people or by fire from the sky. The children of Job were done in by wind. That which was most substantial, their house, was defeated by something that is invisible, an invisible force. The word for wind, as used here and as used in Genesis, for example, is ruach, and it means breath, wind, and spirit. A translator has to choose among those. Obviously, when the messenger was bearing my dog is having a coughing fit. I think I'll continue. It's like an explosive breath, right? Anyway, when the messenger communicated to Job what he had seen, what he had heard with his ears, the sound of the wind, the crash of the building, of the house, he was no doubt speaking of wind, but the same word communicated spirit, and in a way, to use the word spirit here is equally true. The text speaks about a wind, a great wind rising, or a wind becoming great. Remember that the instigator of all of this is Chasatan, and he's a spirit, and he becomes great by the authority that God alone can give him and that God gives him. And by that authority, he takes what is most precious from Job. I will admit that I am disturbed by this exclusion of the children of Job from this pattern of translation or transition from one form of life to another. Because when I see in Hebrew poetry a pattern subtly wrought that seems to extend to all elements of the poem but one, I am strongly tempted to see how that pattern can extend to the seemingly separate part of the poem. And I want to do that here, and maybe that's what the author of the book of Job had in mind. Maybe this is an invitation from the poet to think that maybe there is no true end to life, that there's always a translation, even if we don't see how it works. And maybe this is implicit in a metaphor that Job uses, and we're just about to get to Job. He uses a metaphor that I find to be awkward. He talks about, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I shall return there. It's a very awkward metaphor, but in my mind it leads in a straight line to a metaphor that a man named Jesus used with a man named Nicodemus when he said that in order to enter the kingdom of heaven, we must be reborn. And in Nicodemus's mind, he figured, well, how can a man re-enter his mother's womb? Do you see the relationship between that part of the Bible and this part? But in a way, it makes perfect sense. We tend not to think about the womb as a place of death. We think about it as a place of gestation, a place of creating life. And if, in this great transition, we metaphorically return to the nothingness that was before. Maybe, in returning metaphorically to the womb, we are returning to a place of life and we are born again. Maybe it's just a metaphor. Maybe it's more than that. But it's a good segue into our discussion of Job in this chapter, in this end to the first chapter of the book of Job. Job is not translated, is not transformed, at least as much as he will be in this episode, in this part of the book of Job, in the first chapter. But all of the book of Job is about his translation, his transformation, his rebirth. And it resembles something that an ancient mystic wrote about in the, I want to say, 16th century. St. John of the Cross wrote of the dark night of the soul. The germ of his idea is that in order to draw close to God, everything else that delights you, which gets in the way of that closeness to God, must be removed, must be taken away. And that's what's happened to Job and will continue to happen. Now, he will have, as it were, some Sherpas through this transition, and most people regard them as not necessarily helpful Sherpas because they are his friends, Zophar, Eliphaz, and Bildad. But before we get to them, the devil is not done with Job yet.